Hey everyone, this is Ivy from SparkFlow, and today I'm here with Skylar Wang from Blake. She is the 2022 TOC PF Gold Best Speaker and the PF champion of the 2022 NDCA National Championships. It's so nice to have you here.
Yeah, it's nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much for doing this with me. I think this is probably going to be an awesome opportunity for me and other Chinese debaters to better understand the PF space in the US. Yeah, so I was kind of hoping that we could start off with a brief introduction. So, how and when did you get started in public forum debate?
I started when I was in ninth grade, and I actually got into debate because my brother was heavily involved in debate when he was in high school. And so our school has like a fairly established debate program. And so I got involved because it was really accessible and because I sort of have some family background in it too.
That's awesome. So did you move into varsity
Yeah.
right away?
No, I started in my novice division, and I actually was like a quite unsuccessful novice. I think I was one of like 11 teams who didn't break at or sorry, I was the only team out of the 11 other novice teams we had that didn't break at novice states. So novice year's a little rough for me, but I moved up into varsity division throughout like the normal trajectory, which is just going novice and then going JV for a year and then varsity for the last two.
So are there any, significant differences that you would point out maybe between novice and JV and varsity?
Um, I would just say, like, in terms of the debate environment, like the judging environment is a lot more friendly and like open to giving advice and feedback in the novice and JV divisions than in the varsity divisions. So, like, one thing I'd probably say is that for debaters who are new and incoming in novice and JV divisions, like, don't be afraid or hesitant at all to ask questions because judges are very receptive to that sort of stuff in those divisions and they really love to give feedback. So, I think the main difference is more how willing judges are to sort of like engage with students from a teaching perspective in novice and JV.
Yeah, that makes sense. So recently, a lot of, Chinese debaters have been looking to move into the varsity division, but, as PF becomes more and more progressive, it's becoming a lot harder to engage in a lot of those debates, especially when Chinese debaters are kind of smacked with disclosure theory when they might not even know that a wiki exists. So I guess
Yeah.
sort of, yeah, a two-part question. So how common are T arguments and critiques in varsity, and do debaters necessarily have to get better at progressive debating in order to survive the division?
Okay, so in terms of how common they are, I'd say it really depends on what sort of tournament you're attending. So with tournaments that have a lot of like highly experienced judges or judges who have been part of the community for a long time, they're probably more attuned to arguments that are related to theory or critiques and stuff. And so they're also pretty rare to get generally still in the pool, but like in tournaments where they're more common in the judging pool, then you should be more aware of the fact that it's probably a high likelihood that you're going to get T or disclosure or something like that read on you for judges who believe in those practices. So I'd say it's like actually becoming fairly common. I think I maybe have at least one like theory or critique related debate per national circuit tournament that I attend. And that's even given the fact that like we practice the styles of debate like disclosure or like reading cut cards that people usually read theory on. So like even with these practices, we still have some theory or critical argument debate. So I'd say it's like pretty common. And in terms of whether or not you need to understand them to be able to survive a debate, I think the answer is you don't need to understand how to debate them like really well, but you should spend like a decent amount of time thinking about your practices because like the purpose of these arguments isn't really to just like shut debaters out of the conversation or like get them to like lose round. It's to like actually change the practices in the direction of the community. So I think the answer to that is probably like think about these practices, think about whether or not you actually believe in paraphrasing over cut cards or cut cards over paraphrasing, whether or not you think disclosure is good, and then implement those practices that you believe in. And then it becomes a lot easier to not have theory read on you. And also, if you do have theory read on you, it becomes a lot more genuine in your defense of your practices. But I do think it is helpful to learn the basic structure of theory and critiques, or just like watch a few rounds or do a few practice debates with friends and stuff like that to sort of get into it. So I think like a quick summary is probably that you don't have to know it, but you should think about your practices and be able to intuitively understand why you're doing them. And it is helpful to also know a basic structure.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So what's your personal experience with running these progressive arguments or, competing against them, which I think you've already mentioned that, you'll have at least one per national circuit tournament.
Yeah. In terms of running them, like I also didn't familiarize myself with them like deeply until I was maybe in like the second half of my junior year. So I'd say like I don't run them as frequently as a lot of like debaters who are really in tune with the national circuit do. The one exception is that I really enjoy and feel like passionate about running arguments that are related to like women's issues and stuff. And so this year, my partner and I have centered a lot of arguments around those, though they're not necessarily like critical arguments always. And I think if we talk more about this like later in the interview, I can explain the difference that I think exists between like critical identity-based arguments and identity-based arguments that are still tied to the topic. So that's the experience I have in terms of running them. Also, like I think in terms of more theory-based arguments, I have ran like theory arguments maybe 2 or 3 times throughout my career, but I'm also not deeply comfortable with them, and I prefer and feel like it's more productive to debate like critical or identity related arguments.
Yeah, I definitely remember I think it was the woman case about drug use in the Ivy Street round robin.
Yeah.
Yeah, those were posted on YouTube.
Oh, gotcha.
Yeah, so I think you've already mentioned, some of the value you see in T arguments and critiques, but oftentimes we hear about like frivolous theory. So what exactly, differentiates educational theory or critiques and something that might be more frivolous? Like I think I've heard of shoe theory for people who wear the wrong
Yeah.
shoes.
I think a lot of it is also kind of just like a gut check. So like if you hear it and you're like, this is stupid, then it probably is stupid. But part of it is also like what direction the community is going. So I know that like in other formats of high school debate, like policy or LD, for example, it's way more common practice to read cut cards and disclose. So in that situation, like disclosure theory and paraphrasing are less commonly read. And like in policy, I've heard that it's virtually never read because everyone reads cut cards and no one really paraphrases. And so it really depends on the direction of the debate community. But I think in the US specifically, right now, disclosure and paraphrasing are generally accepted as like non-frivolous theory, though it also really varies from judge to judge. And I think this is one looking at judge paradigms is really important because judges will often like explicitly tell you whether or not they will evaluate disclosure or paraphrasing, whether or not they consider it legitimate theory. So I think it's very case to case, but generally speaking, disclosure and paraphrasing are like okay. And then if you think it's ridiculous, it probably is.
Yeah, so that actually brings me to my next question, which is, how has running progressive arguments sort of influenced how you approach judge adaptation, especially for the lay or parent judges? Like, do you just not ever read them in front of them?
So like in terms of the arguments that are structured, like what you would traditionally consider progressive arguments, so like critical arguments where you read a rule of the ballot that's not tied to the topic, or theory-based arguments, I would say generally like, yeah, we don't read them in front of parent or lay judges just because it's never a productive conversation. And usually it just throws the judges off or confuses them or can make them more like disinclined to try to think about those issues in the first place. So oftentimes it can be counterproductive. But in terms of like identity related arguments, my partner and I have still read some of those, though not as like progressive, I'd say, in front of parent judges. So you can definitely read arguments you're still passionate about, just not as like intensely technical or like jargon based, I guess.
So would you, like, for example, sort of customize your theory format, like away from the ABCD format and maybe to something that operates more as an overview? Like, would that make the argument more accessible?
Yeah, totally. I think that like for me and my partner, at least during my personal preference, I usually wouldn't read like overview based arguments, even if it was like not a theory shell in front of parent judges, unless it was something like pretty egregious, like the other team was just misrepresenting evidence or no reading like really no evidence at all, in which case I think like an overview is justified. But I do think that the overview is like a really good strategy for making a theory argument that's not in the form of a shell in front of more like mid-level experienced judges, so judges who aren't fully comfortable with theory but like sort of know the idea of it and are interested in those ideas. So yeah, I think that is like a really good way to approach it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So I guess kind of moving on to the identity K or just Ks in general. My first question here would be, what are your thoughts on teams running T arguments or critiques about marginalizing a group of people while not being a part of that group themselves, right? So for example, I think there has always been that belief that maybe male debaters will start reading, gender Ks, or for example, non-Black debaters will read Afro-pessimism and something of that sort.
I see. I personally wouldn't read an argument that I'm not like for an identity group that I'm not part of, but that's mostly because I feel like I don't have enough. I think, in my opinion, like when you read identity-based arguments, a lot of the evidence and research that goes into it isn't just stuff that you find online and cards that you cut. It's also a lot of personal experience and being able to like relate or understand on a non like objective level of what the experiences you're talking about feel like. So I think that I'm not well versed enough in terms of both the knowledge and the experience for identities that I'm not a group of, so I wouldn't read them. But in terms of my opinion of other people reading them, I think it's like legitimate for people to read them if they're not part of the identity group in a resolutional sense. So like if they're reading arguments about prioritizing women under the resolution, even if the two debaters on the team both identify as men, I think that's totally reasonable. I think it becomes a little bit more shaky when you read like discursive arguments about why it's important to like represent that group or like use it as an act of resistance, just because oftentimes these debaters don't have the experiences that like the members of the community have. So they often misrepresent the arguments when they're reading them, even if they have really good intentions. So I think it's just good to be cautious about that, do your reading up. And ultimately it's still like each individual debater's decision, but I would probably caution against it if you don't have those experiences.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So I guess the second question for identity Ks in particular is that how should debaters really approach answering these identity Ks without attacking this identity in some sort of way? Or is it just my role as a debater to sort of concede the round and concede to the movement that they might be promoting in their K?
I definitely don't think that it's like the role of the debater to just concede the round, because I think oftentimes, even if you're feeling very uncertain, like the purpose of a debate space is to have people to bounce ideas off of and have people to challenge and question your existing assumptions and stuff. And so I think that it's always productive to challenge the premise of the identity K, though I do not think that you should ever do that in like attacking another debater's identity. So for the first question, I think I would say the way you answer an identity K effectively is more by looking at like the reasoning they provide behind the K. So for example, like the basic structure of like an identity K is that you have framework where you have the role of the ballot, and then you have alternatives, and you usually have like a link into the resolution or like a case as well. So like I think an effective way to attack these arguments without attacking the identity is to contest what the role of the ballot is. And that looks like, for example, presenting your own role of the ballot. So saying like, our role of the ballot is to vote for the team that like best interrogates the question of the resolution or something like that. And that attempts to recenter the debate around what you were originally going into it, like preparing for and stuff. And then it just becomes like the same as any other debate situation. So you present your reasoning for why you think that's a better model of debate, and then you move on to attacking their model of debate without attacking their identity. So for example, like a very common reinterpretation of the role of the ballot is like, our role of the ballot is to use debate as a space for survival. And that's typically associated with like anti-Blackness arguments and stuff like that. And in those situations, then like when you attack their role of the ballot, you would make arguments about like why debate is a bad environment survival, why it tokenizes the issue, like why it allows judges to have like a free lunch and free themselves of guilt and stuff like that. And then you can just read very traditional and intuitive arguments to answer the role of the ballot. So like you can read your non-uniques as well, like proposing alternative methods to solve that don't involve their method of debate. And that is how you would effectively address an identity-based argument without actually like questioning the identity itself, I guess. Like you attack the arguments, not the identity.
So what are your thoughts on identity Ks that don't necessarily link into the resolution? I think the example that kind of comes to mind is the one that Dalton SY ran throughout the TOC, 2020 TOCs. I'm not too sure if they did have a link into the resolution, but I don't think that they did. So when it comes to those arguments, sort of how do they operate? And is it the same way of responding?
I think that it is the same way of responding, which I talked about before. So those arguments, sometimes they'll be more fluid in how they present their role of the ballot, but like a really good skill to develop when you're trying to answer arguments that are totally unrelated to the topic is to identify what model of debate this team is advocating for. I don't really remember what Dalton's argument is from the TOC, but like I can, like some other examples are like oftentimes debaters will advocate to transform the debate space into like an act of like expression or performance and stuff like that. And oftentimes they won't say that explicitly. And if they do say it explicitly, then like really hold on to that. And that is what you center your rebuttal around or like your answers around. But if they don't say it explicitly, then just spend a solid amount of time and like take the time that you need to just identify what model of debate they're representing. And then I think the approach is very similar from there in terms of how you answer it. You attack their model of debate, you present an alternative model of debate, which is your role of the ballot, and then you justify yours while answering theirs.
Okay, yeah, that definitely makes sense. I do have a quick follow-up on the concept of a role of the ballot. So the traditional role of the ballot, I think, is for the judge to promote a better debater. I think so. But so a question that I've always kind of had for alternative role of the ballots is, you know, how would you weigh roll the ballots when ultimately it just comes down to the fact that, you know, both sides are trying to win the ballot?
I think that like the way you can do it is by making your language a bit more specific about the role of the ballot. So like some like teams will often default to like vote for the team that does the better debating, but that is in itself like a very vague descriptor. Like what is better debating? Is it like representing your identity? Is it debating the resolution? Stuff like that. So I think just using really specific language when you propose your role of the ballot can help the judge decide when both teams are like trying to do the best debating and that sort of stuff. So like, for example, you can sort of tailor your role of the ballot to the arguments that you know you're going to go for, even if your model of debate is still to debate the resolution. Like in context of answering a securitization K, like you can make your role of the ballot something like to interrogate the question of the resolution and truth seek and be specific about it or something like that, because you know that a lot of the arguments you're going to read in answer to securitization is that they're being too general, they're not specific enough and stuff like that. And so you can tailor your role of the ballot to the arguments you know you're going to read. And the same goes for like identity Ks. Like for example, if you know you're going to read a case-based argument about women, then you can say like the role of the ballot is to vote for the team that best interrogates the question of the resolution and centers it around women or something like that. And so you can make these like additional tag-ons or slight revisions to your role of the ballot, even if your general model or method of debate is the same, in order to make it a bit easier for the judge.
Honestly, I think that's super interesting because there were a ton of security days in the, you know, in the recent TOC topic about Japan.
Yeah, securitization is a really fun and good argument to look into, I think.
I think it really is. So is there a specific way that your school practices, you know, running or responding to progressive arguments? Like how is that practice structured?
I think the structure of it is like, usually if a team is interested in those arguments, then they're the ones who initiate and lead the research on that argument. And then like we have a very like well-established community within our team, so we share all our evidence with each other and stuff like that. And so after like a team has done the research for an argument and they've talked to a coach about it or something, usually like if another team is curious about it, it's just like the two teams will chat casually about it, or like they'll have a practice round about it or something like that, or like the coaches will chat with the other teams about it. So it's really just like a lot of it comes down to just like casual like hallway conversations about the arguments and stuff. But a big part of being able to like understand the argument on a deeper level is like asking your teammates to do practice rounds and stuff like that. So I think it's important to have like a really good team culture that emphasizes community when you're learning these arguments, because it's good to have people to practice about and like share and just discuss these things with in general.
Yeah, that makes sense. So this
Mhm.
is actually sort of a shift away from the progressive arguments, but I noticed that you mentioned how team culture is really important when it comes to debate prep. And so
Yeah,
for
totally.
context, for context in China, debate clubs just aren't that developed. And there's
Mhm.
a sort of culture to never share prep and to never disclose. And
Mhm.
especially with the prep thing, even within clubs, there are always these sort of hierarchies where, simply some evidence should be kept secret, some should be kept private.
Mhm.
So I guess my question is, you know, could you maybe give some examples of the benefits of, sharing prep with other team members and, sort of how that has impacted you as a debater?
Yeah, totally. I think it's like it makes sense that it's like an intuitive reaction for debaters to want to like save their work for themselves, because you've put a lot of time into it, and often it's like difficult and it seems like you're putting yourself at a disadvantage by sharing it with others. But I think in reality, like once you really start debating more often and stuff like that, you begin to realize that like evidence and research and the work that you do, it's not really like a zero sum game where like if you have it and someone doesn't, like you're at an advantage, whereas if you both have it. And I think that sort of comes with thinking about like why you value debate in the first place. So like the reason debate exists is so that you can have really thorough and like genuine conversations with people in an environment that makes it competitive and incentivizes you to go deeper into these questions and stuff. And so I think with that in mind, one reason, like even if you believe it is true that it'll make it harder for yourself to share evidence with your teammates or your opponents or stuff like that, it actually creates like more thorough conversations when you do so. So I think that's like one good reason to do it. But I also don't necessarily think that it puts you at like a big disadvantage, because like sort of going back to what we were talking about earlier, if you don't disclose and stuff like that, then it's very likely that you'll get theory read on you, and then you'll just end up losing those rounds anyways. And then the other thing I'd say is that like if you're relying on the element of surprise by not disclosing in order to beat your opponents, and that's because you have like slightly lower quality evidence than you'd like or something like that, then that's probably a good indicator that you should be spending more time researching your arguments and like being able to do solid prep on them. Because like when it comes to higher levels of debate, like the element of surprise is not going to be enough to win rounds against your opponent. So I think just for the sake of like your success in the long term, and like just like I guess that's basically it. Just like in terms of your success in the long term, and being able to consistently win still when you get into higher levels of debate, it's a good practice to just start disclosing from like a younger age, I guess, because that will incentivize you to do better research and you won't be winning based off of the element of surprise. But in terms of like the team culture that's around sharing evidence, I think this is like a really, really good practice to have. And that's because like when you shouldn't see your teammates as people you're competing with, because like really a lot of the practice and a lot of the knowledge that I get about debate comes from talking to the people around you. So I think sharing evidence is good, not only because it's like a really efficient way to get work done, and then to like, especially if you're a little bit time crunch on one topic, if your teammates can like step up for you, that's really, really helpful. But also because like when you share evidence, it just makes it like a less competitive culture with your teammates. And honestly, like the debaters at my school are some of my closest friends. And so like it transforms debate not really into like just an after school extracurricular, but also somewhere where you have like really close friendships and you can depend upon these people. And that's actually really, really important to have in an environment like debate, because it is such a competitive and harsh activity sometimes. And so it's good to have, you know, these support systems that you can lean back on and stuff like that. So yeah, I would advise sharing evidence with your teammates, trying to get your coaches to like actively like facilitate that within your team if it's a little bit difficult to do it yourself, and also disclosing for the reasons I talked about earlier.
Yeah, that honestly sounds, really awesome. So hopefully that'll become, more of the norm here in China. So yeah, there are tons, if not, hundreds of tea arguments and critiques. So do you, prepare block files for each of them? Or, is preparing for that many block files or preparing that many block files even necessary?
I think it also depends on your practices. So if you know that you're not going to be reading cut cards, then you should anticipate paraphrasing theory and stuff like that. And so like I think it's important to have block files for arguments that are very common, that are specific to the practices that you're doing. But in terms of more like frivolous or unexpected theory, I think that you should fall back on the principle of like the reason it's unexpected and frivolous is because it's not a great argument in the first place. And in that situation, like when you hear them read on you, like don't panic, don't go to your block file, because it'll be very easy to generate intuitive arguments in your head answering these. So I would say yes, block file for important and very common T or K arguments that are specific to the topic, but no block file for like every single argument or like frivolous ones.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So how do you see PF developing in the future? Is it going to become more and more progressive, to the point of kind of where LD is right now? Or would you say that it's going to stay at a sort of balance point where, it's a balance between LD and what public forum traditionally is?
To be honest, I'm not really sure because I have 4 years of experience in public forum, and it's hard to predict where the activity will go in the long run. But from what I've experienced, what I think is that it seems like there's a trend towards like more policy type practices. Like a lot more teams are disclosing on the wiki. I think when teams first started disclosing on the wiki like 5-ish years ago, it was only 1 or 2 schools, and now there's a lot of schools on the wiki and a lot of the top teams are disclosing. So I think that is definitely a direction the community is trending in terms of like frivolous arguments and stuff. I know at least in LD there's like tricks and that sort of stuff. I think PF judges are still like fairly traditional to the point where they aren't receptive to that sort of stuff. I think they become receptive when they come into PF from other activities like LD. So I'd say like generally the community is going in a pretty good direction in terms of following like the progressive norms of disclosure and reading cut cards, but not necessarily in the direction of like frivolous, tricky type stuff.
I see. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So I think we're probably nearing the end of this interview. But before we go, do you have any general advice for Chinese debaters who are looking to tackle, national circuit tournaments?
I'd say just like go for it and don't be discouraged, because it's really easy, especially because like I'm sure in terms of traveling from China to the US, it's like very expensive and it seems like it's a very time consuming activity. But don't be discouraged and don't put a lot on one tournament just because it's really volatile at these national tournaments. But if you consistently put in the work and if you're consistently doing drills, watching rounds and that sort of stuff, practicing with your teammates, like it's basically a guarantee that you get better. Like at least in my personal experience, I really did not have a lot of success in my early years and I was really on the edge of quitting. But if you continue putting in like the work and especially if you have good support systems to basically encourage you to stay in the activity and keep doing what you're doing, like you'll get there. And that's basically a guarantee for debaters who put in the time and the effort. So yeah, I guess that's my main piece of advice. It's easy to get discouraged, but once you push through the hump, it'll be really satisfying.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you again for having this interview. I look forward to, hopefully seeing you debate in college. I'm not too sure. But
yeah, I'm also not too sure.
yeah. Anyways, thank you so much. I guess I will end the recording here.